Thanksgiving was supposed to be a time for family, warmth, and togetherness. But that year, it became the night I questioned everything I thought I knew about the people I loved. It started with an empty chair at the dinner table, a chair no one had set. Yet there it was, pristine, perfectly positioned between my Uncle Dave and me. And as soon as I noticed it, things began to spiral. The chair wasn't supposed to be there. We counted out exactly 8 people: Mom, Dad, me, my sister Jenna, Uncle Dave, Aunt Laura, and their 2 kids. Yet, the 9th chair stood starkly against the dim glow of the dining room chandelier, its presence heavy and impossible to ignore. "Who's that for?" I asked, pointing at the chair. The conversation around the table hushed abruptly. Everyone stared at me, their expressions unreadable. For a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "It's tradition," my mom said finally, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Don't worry about it, sweetheart. Let's eat." But I couldn't shake the unease. I'd been through plenty of Thanksgivings at this house, and I'd never seen that chair before. As we dug into the turkey and mashed potatoes, I noticed no one mentioned the chair again. Yet something was off. My family, usually boisterous and lively during meals, was subdued, speaking in hushed tones and avoiding eye contact. Then it happened. The lights flickered once, twice, before plunging the room into darkness. Jenna let out a startled yelp, and the table erupted into chaos. Someone fumbled for the matches to light the candles, and when the room was illuminated again, the chair had moved. It was no longer beside me, it was now at the head of the table. "What the hell?" I whispered, but no one responded. My mom's face had gone pale, and Uncle Dave looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Let's just finish dinner," Aunt Laura said, her voice trembling. But her words sounded forced, like she was trying to convince herself. The meal dragged on, and every bite felt heavier than the last. I kept glancing at the chair, half expecting it to move again. The air in the room grew colder, and despite the roaring fire in the hearth, I could see my breath in front of me. When dessert was served, Mom brought out the pumpkin pie, and that's when I saw it. On the side of the pie, etched deep into the crust, were the words, "I'm here." My stomach dropped. "Mom, what is this?" I demanded, my voice rising. But she didn't answer. She just stared at the pie, her hands trembling. "We shouldn't have done this," Jenna whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Done what?" I asked, my frustration boiling over, but before anyone could answer, the chandelier above us began to sway, the crystals clinking together in a rhythmic, almost taunting manner. And then we heard it, a knock at the front door, slow, deliberate, and far too loud for comfort. "No," Aunt Laura said, her voice barely audible. "We don't answer it." "What do you mean we don't answer it?" I shouted. "Who is it? What's going on?" But they ignored me. Everyone sat, frozen, their eyes glued to the door at the end of the hallway. The knocking came again, louder this time, reverberating through the house. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood, marching toward the door, but Uncle Dave grabbed my arm with a strength that shocked me. "Don't," he hissed, his face a mask of fear. "Someone needs to explain what's going on," I said, yanking my arm free. "Now." "It's the chair," Jenna said through sobs. "We shouldn't have set the chair." "What does that mean?" I demanded, but before anyone could answer, the knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the front door creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. A cold wind swept through the house, extinguishing the candles and leaving us in pitch black. The next few moments were a blur. I heard chairs scraping against the floor, my family screaming, and something else. A low, guttural growl that didn't sound human. When the lights came back on, the chair was gone. So was Jenna. We searched the house, the woods, and the surrounding neighborhood, but there was no trace of her. The police were called, and they chalked it up to a tragic case of a runaway teenager, but I knew better. My family refused to talk about that night again. Thanksgiving was never celebrated in our house after that. The knock at the door came just as the turkey hit the table. It wasn't a polite tap or the hurried knock of a late guest. It was deliberate, slow, and echoed through the house like a warning. Thanksgiving dinner had always been a cherished tradition for my family, but this year was different. It was just my brother Kyle and me, celebrating alone in our grandmother's old farmhouse, deep in the woods. The isolation was meant to be peaceful, but as the knock sounded again, louder this time, it became anything but. We exchanged uneasy glances. "Did you invite anyone?" I asked, my voice a little too shaky. Kyle shook his head, already moving toward the door. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only people who knew we'd be here were already dead. Kyle peeked through the peephole. "No one's there," he muttered, but the look on his face told a different story. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a tension I'd never seen before. I moved closer, my heart pounding, and together we opened the door. The night outside was still, the forest blanketed in the kind of silence only deep winter could bring. But lying on the porch was a single white envelope, no address, no name, just a crimson wax seal that glistened in the porch light. Kyle picked it up reluctantly, flipping it over in his hands. "Someone's messing with us," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Inside the envelope was a folded piece of parchment, old and brittle. Written in an elegant script were 3 words: "We remember you." My stomach churned. "It's a prank," Kyle said, trying to shake off the unease. But as he turned the envelope over again, something fell out, a small feather, stained red at the tip. We locked the door and tried to shake off the weirdness, sitting back down to eat, but the festive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The forest outside the windows seemed darker than before, as if the night had thickened, pressing against the house. Then the knocking started again. This time it wasn't just the door. The walls seemed to tremble with each thud, the sound reverberating through the house. Kyle grabbed a knife from the table, his face pale. "Who's there?" he shouted, but there was no answer. The knocking stopped, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. The only illumination came from the flickering candles on the table. "Get the flashlight," Kyle whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. As I fumbled for the flashlight, a sound came from upstairs, a slow, deliberate creak, like footsteps on the old wooden floorboards. We hadn't been up there all day. The house was supposed to be empty. "Stay here," Kyle said, gripping the knife tightly as he headed toward the stairs. "Are you insane?" I hissed, grabbing his arm. But he shook me off, determined to confront whatever or whoever was in the house. I stayed by the table, flashlight in hand, straining to hear what was happening. Kyle's footsteps faded as he ascended the stairs. Then there was silence. Minutes stretched on, and he didn't come back. "But, Kyle?" I called out, my voice cracking. No response. Gripping the flashlight like a lifeline, I moved toward the stairs, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The air grew colder with each step, and when I reached the top, I saw it. A trail of bloody feathers leading to the bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, and the faintest glow spilled out. I pushed it open, my breath hitching. The room was empty. But the walls were covered in writing, scrawled in what looked like blood. "We remember you. We always remember you." In the center of the room was the knife Kyle had taken, stuck upright in the floor. And next to it was a photograph, old and yellowed, but unmistakable. It was a picture of my family, taken years ago at this very house, but something was wrong. Standing behind us in the photo was a figure, its face obscured by shadow. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. My grandmother used to tell us stories about the house, about the strange things she had seen and heard, but we'd always laughed it off, chalking it up to her age. Now I wasn't so sure. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the flashlight and leaving me in total darkness. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint but clear. We never left. I ran down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out the front door, not stopping until I reached the car. But Kyle wasn't there. He never came out. The police searched the house and the surrounding woods for days, but found no trace of him. The only thing they discovered was the photograph, now smeared with blood. I never went back to the farmhouse, and every Thanksgiving, when the leaves fall and the air turns cold, I hear it, a knock at my door, slow and deliberate. I don't answer. I can't, because I know that if I do, I'll see Kyle standing there, holding a crimson-stained feather. And he won't be alone. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a quiet affair that year. My sister and I had planned a small dinner at my parents' old house, nestled deep in the woods, far from the chaos of the city. The house had been abandoned for years after they passed, but it felt like the right time to return. To honor them in the place where so many family members had been made. But when we arrived, something about the house felt off. The driveway was overgrown, the windows clouded with dust, and the air carried a strange metallic ting. As we stepped inside, the heavy silence wrapped around us like a shroud. The dining table was exactly as we'd left it years ago. Chairs tucked neatly under the table as if waiting for guests. But it wasn't the emptiness that unsettled me. It was the single plate, sitting at the head of the table, clean and gleaming, as though someone had prepared it for tonight. I dismissed it as my sister's doing. She always had a flair for theatrics. But when I asked her about it, she swore she hadn't touched anything. That was the first crack in my resolve, the first inkling that something wasn't right. We spent the day cleaning and preparing the meal, trying to shake the eerie feeling. As evening fell, the house came alive with shadows cast by the dark, endless sea. By the time we sat down to eat, the silence had grown unbearable. My sister kept glancing toward the head of the table, where that plate sat, untouched but undeniably present. "Maybe we should move it," I said, trying to lighten the mood. But as I reached for the plate, a loud knock echoed through the house. It wasn't the polite kind of knock you'd expect from a neighbor or a late guest. It was loud, deliberate, and insistent. My sister and I froze, exchanging uneasy glances. We hadn't invited anyone. No one even knew we were here. Maybe it's a lost hiker, she whispered, her voice shaky. But we both knew that was unlikely. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the woods weren't exactly friendly to wanderers. I grabbed a flashlight and moved cautiously toward the door. The knocking stopped as I approached. Through the peephole, all I could see was darkness. The porch empty, except for the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. My hand hovered over the doorknob, every instinct screaming at me to lock the door and walk away. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door a crack. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. There was no one there, only the forest, stretching endlessly into the void. But as I started to close the door, I noticed something on the porch. A turkey feather, slick with fresh blood, lay at my feet. I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. "What was it?" my sister asked, her voice rising. I showed her the feather, and her face went pale. "It's a prank," she said quickly, as if saying it out loud would make it true. But I could see the fear in her eyes. We tried to continue the dinner, pretending everything was normal, but the atmosphere in the house had shifted. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside felt amplified, sinister. And then it happened again. The knock, louder this time, more forceful, like someone or something was demanding to be let in. My sister grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't open it," she pleaded. I nodded, my heart pounding, but then the knocking turned into pounding, and the walls began to shake. The light overhead flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. And then the voice came. "Let me in," it rasped. Louder, gasped. It didn't sound human. My sister screamed, and I grabbed a kitchen knife, backing us into the corner of the room. The pounding stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. We waited, our breaths ragged, as minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, I crept to the window, peeking out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, but then something moved just at the edge of the tree line. Its face was hidden in shadow. They glowed faintly like embers. I stumbled back, pulling the curtains closed. "We need to leave," I whispered, grabbing my sister's hand. But before we could move, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. The voice returned, this time closer, as if it were inside the house. "You shouldn't have come back," it hissed. The sound was everywhere, surrounding us, suffocating us. My sister was sobbing now, clutching the knife as if it could save us. And then the dining room chair at the head of the table scraped loudly against the floor. We turned, and there it was. The figure seated at the table, its glowing eyes fixed on us. In its hand, it held the bloody feather. It smiled, a grotesque, unnatural expression that stretched its face too far. "Thank you for the invitation," it said, its voice dripping with malice. The last thing I remember is the sound of the windows shattering, the room filling with a blinding light, and the feeling of icy hands grabbing me. When I woke up, it was morning. My sister was gone, and so was the house. I was lying in the middle of a clearing, The Thanksgiving feast spread out around me as if nothing had happened, but the bloody feather was still in my hand. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but every Thanksgiving I hear that knock, and every year it gets louder